Hello. A couple of days ago I was planning this episode, or this video on grammatical gender, when I noticed that Luke Ranieri had uploaded a video on grammatical gender as well, which very elegantly and engagingly covers a lot of the points that I'm planning to cover in this one. So, having said that, hopefully this video is enjoyable nonetheless, and I would very much recommend you go and watch Luke's video on his channel Polymathy, because it's very well done indeed, and it covers these things, I think, more smoothly than I'm about to. But having said that, the difficult thing about filming in this room is that when I'm sitting in this chair I can see all of the beautiful things out the window, but there's no way of showing you out the window and me at the same time without me being horribly underexposed or what's out the window being horribly overexposed. So I thought that would be a fun way of doing it. Today I'm going to be talking about a topic that a kind Patreon supporter actually asked me about over a private message. And that's grammatical gender, and this is something that often perplexes English speakers. It sometimes annoys English speakers when they're learning other European languages, and other languages in general, which is this kind of system that, from an English-speaking perspective, it's quite difficult to understand the point of. It's quite hard to understand why grammatical genders exist in languages like Spanish, German, Polish, and so on. It can sometimes feel like they're just there to annoy speakers of languages that don't have grammatical gender trying to learn them. But yeah, this video is going to go into a bit of detail about, at least within Indo-European languages, what the function of grammatical gender might originally have been and how it is likely to have arisen. In a language with grammatical gender, every noun, which is a word describing a person, place, thing or concept, falls into one of two or three gender categories. So in languages like French and Spanish there are two grammatical genders, in languages like German and Polish there are three. And whichever grammatical gender the noun falls into, that dictates how other words will behave around the noun. So I'm going to explain a couple of examples of modern European grammatical gender systems for people who haven't got a good grasp of it, but you can skip to the time shown on screen if you don't want that explanation. Firstly, it's important to understand that grammatical gender most of the time doesn't have anything to do with the social concept of gender or biological sex or anything like that. You could replace the phrase grammatical gender with grammatical category or grammatical colour or something like that, and it would be just as accurate. In German, the word for tree, Baum, is a masculine word, but that doesn't mean that Germans think trees are particularly manly things. It's just a category that the word happens to fall into. So with that in mind, let's take Spanish as our first example. In Spanish, you have a two-gender system, masculine and feminine. So let's take a feminine noun like mesa, apologies for my Spanish pronunciation, which means table. In Spanish, you can be confident that if a noun ends in A, it's feminine, although not all feminine nouns end in A, but mesa does. So the fact that this word is feminine means you have to treat it in a particular way. So for one thing, it affects which form of the word the you use. In Spanish, it can either be la or el, and because mesa is feminine, you have to use the feminine article, la mesa. The gender of the word mesa also affects how you say adjectives that you're using to describe the mesa. If you wanted to say the table is small, you would say it's pequeña with this a ending, which is the feminine adjective ending. So you'd say la mesa pequeña. If you were talking about a dog, a perro, the word perro is masculine, so you'd use the masculine form of the article, this masculine o ending. El perro pequeño. If you had lots of tables and lots of dogs, you'd change the article and endings to match that. You'd say las mesas pequeñas or los perros pequeños. Bear in mind that in Spanish, not all adjectives take gendered endings. The word grande, meaning big, stays the same. El perro grande, la mesa grande. This system is fairly straightforward, and I personally found it quite easy to learn when I was studying Spanish. Now let's look at an example of a three-gender system. That kind of system actually existed in Old English, but for the sake of using a modern language, let's look at German. German has three genders, which are masculine, feminine, and neuter. And those genders work in basically the same way as the Spanish ones. The system is just a bit more complicated. So take a word like Hund, which is masculine. German famously has three nominative words for the, which are der, die, and das. And for this we need the masculine form, which is der, so der Hund. If you wanted to say brown dog, the adjective brown, braun, would have to take a masculine ending, which in this case is a, which is spelled er for historical reasons. So you have brauner Hund. If you wanted to talk about a leaf, Blatt, which is neuter, you'd pick the neuter article, so the leaf would be das Blatt. And if you wanted to say brown leaf, you'd say braunes Blatt. You'd add this us ending, which is the neuter adjective ending. Now it's more complicated because, like in Spanish, if you have lots of dogs or lots of leaves, you have to change the form of the article and the adjective endings again. So brown leaves would be braune Blätter, brown dogs would be braune Hunde. In fact, when the adjective describes a plural noun like leaves and dogs, the endings don't distinguish between masculine, feminine and neuter anymore, it's always just a. But then there's yet another complication, which is grammatical case, whether something is the subject of a sentence, the object or whatever. That also changes the article and the adjective ending. So the dog ate would be der Hund hat gefressen, but I ate the dog would be ich hab den Hund gegessen. The article changes because of the case. If you said I ate the leaf, it would be ich hab das Blatt gegessen. So this is the same case but a different gender. So you have to choose adjective endings in articles based on a combination of case, gender and number. And if you don't get it right, you sound like a foreigner. As you can imagine, this system is much more of a pain in the arse to learn, or at least it was for me. But fundamentally it's similar to the Spanish system. You change the forms of adjectives in articles based on the gender of the noun they're describing. Spanish and German are distantly related to each other. They share a common great-grandparent language which we call proto-indo-european, and that was spoken about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, probably somewhere around what's now Ukraine. And accordingly they both inherited their gender systems all the way from proto-indo-european, which had its own system of grammatical gender. And it split into proto-Germanic and Latin, which both inherited that gender system, and then they developed into German and Spanish. So ultimately these two systems are kind of cousins of each other. They come from the same ancestral system. So what was that ancestral system like, and how and why did it develop in the first place? Well, Spanish and German, along with dozens of other languages, descend from late Proto-Indo-European, and late Proto-Indo-European had a system with three genders, like German, masculine, feminine and neuter, and these genders worked in a very similar way. Pult nos queculos, pult nach dom, pult nom doru. So here these three adjective endings, os, ach and are used, and these change depending on case and number, just like in German. Proto-Indo-European didn't have articles like the, but it did have demonstratives like this and that in English, and the gender of a noun also affected the form of the demonstrative that it took. So, soqueklos, sachdom, dodoru. Now remember I said that this seems to have been the grammatical gender system of late Proto-Indo-European, which was the stage of the language spoken just before it broke up into the Germanic and Slavic and Italic and various other groups of languages. But something interesting happens when you go back a bit further in time to early Proto-Indo-European. This was quite a while before all these languages split off, but immediately before the Anatolian languages split off, like Hittite, which is the earliest Indo-European language to have been written down about 4,000 years ago. And Hittite was only decoded relatively recently, and so for a long time our ability to reconstruct early Proto-Indo-European was very limited, because the reconstruction techniques linguists use normally rely heavily on living descendant languages. But it seems as though early Proto-Indo-European, spoken before the Anatolian branch split off from it, only had two grammatical genders. In other words, somewhere between early and late Proto-Indo-European, a third gender had appeared. Anatolian languages split off before that point, so Hittite retained the earlier two-gender system. The other Indo-European languages split off afterwards, so they inherited the newer three-gender system, although as we know, in some of those languages it collapsed back into two or no genders. So this raises some questions. How did this two-gender system originate? How did it work? And how did it turn into the later three-gender system? Well, Hittite's two-gender system can tell us a certain amount about what the early system looked like. Hittite's two genders aren't referred to as masculine and feminine, but animate and inanimate, and we'll come to why that is a bit later, but it works the same way. It's just two categories that nouns can fit into, just like masculine and feminine in Spanish. But despite what you might expect from such an old and intimidating sounding language, the gender system is actually quite simple, and it seems like it would be easy enough to pick up. It works through adjective endings, just like it does in all the other languages we've covered, but almost all of the adjective endings are identical between the two genders. They're only really distinguished in the nominative and accusative cases. So this is a fairly rudimentary gender system compared to one like German's, but it probably reflects the system that existed in early proto-indo-european. Gender is mostly expressed through determiners, which are words like this and that in English, and also adjective endings, as we've discussed. In Proto-Indo-European, like Hittite, there were only two genders, animate and inanimate, and they were only really distinguished from each other in a couple of grammatical cases. All other cases, the endings were usually identical regardless of what gender the noun was. To put it another way, this gender system was a lot less complicated than the German one, and probably would be a lot less effort for a modern English speaker to learn. The case system is still very complicated, but the gender system just doesn't seem to be. So is it possible that this gender system was fairly new at the time Hittite split off from Proto-Indo-European? And how could it have appeared in the first place? To talk about that, I need to come back to why the earlier two-gender system was animate versus inanimate rather than masculine versus feminine. Across a lot of languages worldwide, the animacy of a noun's referent is important, grammatically. So to put that in a less horrible academic way, in a lot of languages worldwide, not including English as far as I can think, how alive something is affects how you treat the noun grammatically. So whether something is a living animate object or an inanimate object affects the grammar of a sentence describing that thing. There's an animacy hierarchy that holds true across a lot of languages. At the top of the hierarchy, you have pronouns referring to speakers that are involved in the conversation, like me and you. Then lower down, you have pronouns referring to speakers not involved in the conversation, like he, she, or they. Lower down still, you have normal nouns referring to people, like Sheila or the bin man. Then lower down, you have animals, and then plants, then inanimate objects that are well individuated, then inanimate objects that aren't well individuated. And by well individuated, I mean basically countable versus uncountable, which would be poorly individuated. So doors, trees, and cats are well individuated because you can count them: 1 door, 2 trees, 3 cats. But water, sadness, and pollen are poorly individuated because you can't have 1 pollen or 1 sadness. So at some point before early Proto-Indo-European was spoken, speakers started making a minor grammatical distinction between things towards the top of this hierarchy and things towards the bottom. And it's not exactly clear where they drew the line between animate things and inanimate things, but in Hittite some words could take either gender, so maybe the line was fairly fuzzy. But how and why did they start making this grammatical distinction between animate and inanimate? The author of this paper suggests that this happened through a common process called grammaticalization, and this is where something starts off as a separate word, then gradually over time it becomes more and more reliant on another word until it just starts to behave as an ending that you add on to the main word in certain situations. So I'll show you how this works using a hypothetical in English. Think about how in English you can express future events by putting the word will before a verb. He will walk, she will pick vegetables, they will speak. In this case, will is a separate word that acts as an auxiliary verb, showing you that the main verb of the sentence happens in the future. Now imagine if over time the word will became more and more reliant on the verb it was attached to. It was never stressed, and maybe it started to phonologically reduce a little bit when people talked quickly. He will walk, she will pick vegetables, they will speak. Eventually, people might do this so much that the verb will no longer really means anything on its own. People don't even consider it a word in its own right, they just consider it a bit that you add to verbs to make them future tense. It's become part of the inflectional paradigm of verbs in general. I walk, I walked, I will walk. This is grammaticalization, where something starts off as a separate word and gradually turns into a grammatical inflection. So maybe a similar process of grammaticalization led to adjectives describing animate things to take some endings in some cases that they didn't take if the things were inanimate in early Proto-Indo-European. By this point it's kind of speculation, but that's the kind of process that might give rise to those kinds of endings. So how did this two-gender system split into a three-gender system? This author suggests the following stages. I mentioned that Proto-Indo-European had a demonstrative corresponding to this or that in English that changed depending on if it was an animate or an inanimate noun. Well, with the animate form of this demonstrative, so, people started adding another sound to the end of it if it referred to a female referent. This got extended to adjectives which were describing things which the speakers considered to be feminine or female, so they would add this "ach" ending at some point in the word, in a way that's appropriate to Proto-Indo-European morphology, which I don't understand very well, so I can't explain the details of where it got added and where it didn't get added, but this "ach" ending signified femininity in some way. What's happened is that the animate gender has split into masculine and feminine, and the old inanimate gender has stuck around as neuter. Aside from all that, I think it's just an interesting bit of historical linguistics, and I think that paper by the author whose name I can't pronounce and have so far avoided pronouncing in this video is very interesting, and it goes into a lot of things I haven't mentioned here, like the function of grammatical gender, which Luc Ranieri covers in his video on polymathy, and also things like why certain things that are more animate than others might have been considered more important within a sentence and how that might have affected things grammatically. So there's a very, very interesting paper that I would recommend you read. But other than that, hopefully this has answered a few questions, and thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.